The lights went out at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Mara Voss learned something about the universe that she could never unlearn. She had boarded the transit pod at Messastatwest Station the way she boarded it every night, shoulders forward, bag pulled close, eyes fixed on the middle distance that people on public transit use as a social contract. Don't look at me. I won't look at you. We'll arrive at our stops and go our separate ways and never exist to one another. It was a law as old as cities. The pod hissed shut. The maglev field engaged with its familiar subsonic hum. Outside, the tunnel swallowed them whole. There were 3 others in the car. Mara cataloged them in the automatic way she'd developed over years of night commutes. An older man in a gray coat, reading a physical newspaper folded into quarters newspapers. Still, in 2031, she found it oddly comforting. A woman around Mara's age, late 30s, dark complexion, wearing the blue uniform lanyard of the Orbital Infrastructure Authority. And something else. She didn't look directly at the third one. You learned not to. It sat in the far corner of the car, folded into itself in the way a praying mantis folds, the body proportions wrong in the quiet way that wrongness announces itself to the hindbrain before the forebrain has caught up. Long. Pale in the way a thing is pale when the pigment in its skin serves a different purpose than reflecting light. It wore the standard-issue transit cloak, the hooded, gender-neutral garment the city had mandated 3 years ago, after first contact, because the alternative was letting rush hour become a daily ethnographic exhibition. The cloak covered it almost entirely. Almost. Mara looked at her hands instead. She had learned in 3 years to look at her hands. The veil had been with them for 37 months. They had arrived not with fire or fanfare, but with a quiet bureaucratic efficiency that humanity, in all its science fiction, had never imagined. A single vessel, 40 kilometers long, which had entered a stable parking orbit without announcement, and then, 6 hours later, transmitted a single message in 117 languages. We are here to learn. We mean no harm. We would like to apply for residency status. The panic had lasted approximately 9 days. Then the paperwork had started, and somehow that was worse and better simultaneously. The veil were 7 feet tall on average, bilaterally asymmetric, with 2 forward-facing sensory clusters and 4 upper limbs that telescoped rather than jointed. They did not speak with mouths. They did not have mouths, not precisely. They had lateral resonance chambers that produced subsonic communication they'd learned, with visible effort, to modulate into human acoustic ranges. Their speech sounded like a cello played very slightly out of tune, and Mara had read that some people found it beautiful, and some people found it profoundly wrong, and she had never settled on which camp she occupied. They had asked for nothing. They had offered technology, culture exchange, academic collaboration. They had submitted to the UN residency framework with something that their translators described as cooperative patience, and which the less charitable corners of the internet described as something Mara didn't repeat in polite company. She stared at her hands. The transit pod decelerated, not with the purpose of a scheduled stop, but with the lurching, queasy deceleration of a system cutting power mid-run. The lights shifted from white to amber. The subsonic hum of the maglev dropped a fifth in pitch. Then the amber lights died. Black, complete and absolute. Mara heard the older man exhale sharply. She heard the OIA woman shift in her seat, the rustle of the lanyard, the squeak of fabric on the molded seat. She heard her own breathing. She did not hear the veil move. That was the thing people didn't understand about them. For all that they were large and architecturally improbable, they were quiet in a way that had nothing to do with effort or stealth. They were quiet the way a deep lake is quiet, not silent, but operating in registers that human ears weren't tuned for. Mara's friend Daniela, who worked in xenobiology, had explained it once over wine. They evolved in cavern systems. Total darkness, high pressure, complete acoustic saturation from underground water systems. Their whole nervous system is calibrated for dark and for depth. They don't see the way we see. They perceive. The light we find comfortable is noise to them. The dark we find terrifying is clarity. The emergency phosphorescence in the floor strips took 3 seconds to activate. 3 seconds of total darkness. In those 3 seconds, Mara became aware that something in the car had changed. The floor strips came up, sickly green-white, barely enough to see shapes by. The older man was sitting very still, his newspaper clutched in both hands, his face arranged into the careful blankness of someone performing calm. The OIA woman had her hand on the emergency panel on the wall beside her and was reading it, running her finger over the braille text, checking options. And the veil was no longer in the corner. Mara's heart did something it had never done before, a kind of full-body clench, every muscle contracting in the same instant. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to look. The veil was crouched in the center of the car. Not crouched like something preparing to attack, crouched like a person would crouch if they suddenly felt ill, low, contained, the upper limbs gathered in. It was looking at her. She knew it was looking at her even though it had no eyes in any arrangement she recognized as eyes. The forward sensory clusters had oriented toward her, and she had learned by now what orientation meant. It made a sound. Cello, low, slightly off-key, modulated into the range of comprehensible speech with the obvious effort it always cost them. 3 words. She had enough of the common vocabulary to parse it. You are afraid. Mara opened her mouth, closed it, thought about 3 years of news cycles, of transit etiquette guidelines issued by the Integration Commission, of the 47 pages of the coexistence framework that governed interactions in shared public spaces, and about how none of it was relevant right now, in the dark, on a stopped train, with a 7-foot alien crouched in front of her. Yes, she said. Another sound, longer, more complex. It took her a moment to resolve it. I know, I can hear it. Your heart, the change in your respiration, the shift in the acoustic profile of this space when the lights failed. It heard all of that. The OIA woman had turned from the panel. She wasn't performing calm anymore. Her voice was level, but her hands were braced against the wall. They can hear heartbeats, the older man said. He had put the newspaper in his lap. From about 12 meters, I read a paper on it. Seismic sensitivity in the lower resonance chambers. They evolved to detect movement through stone. The veil's sensory clusters rotated toward him, accurate, within acceptable margins. That's, the OIA woman stopped, restarted. That's not exactly reassuring. No, I imagine it is not. The transit pod was still. The tunnel was darkness outside the scratched windows. The floor strips hummed their thin green light, and somewhere beyond the car walls, Mara could hear the distant groan of infrastructure, the bones of the city, settling. She realized something. The veil had moved to the center of the car when the lights went out, not toward the exits, not toward any of them individually, to the center, where it could see, perceive all of them at once, where it could put itself equidistant from every human in the space. She thought about Daniela's voice over wine. They evolved in cavern systems. You moved to where you could monitor all of us, Mara said. The sensory clusters turned to her again. Yes. Why? A pause, the cello sound of deliberate thought before deliberate speech. Because you were afraid, and afraid things sometimes harm themselves or others, in the dark, when they cannot see. The older man looked up from his newspaper. You were protecting us. I was attempting to. I am not certain I have the word correct. In our language, the concept does not separate cleanly into protect. It is more. Another pause longer, the resonance chambers working, to take responsibility for the space. A cave that holds living things is a cave that must be maintained. The one who can perceive most has the obligation to orient the others. Mara sat with that for a moment. The fear was still there. It would be dishonest to say it wasn't, but it had changed shape. Fear is plastic. It takes the form of whatever vessel holds it. "What's wrong with the train?" the OIA woman asked. She had dropped her hand from the panel. "A resonance failure in the fourth drive coil. I could detect it 3 stations ago as a degradation in the magnetic field harmonics." The OIA woman stared. 3 stations ago, you knew?" "I knew something was degrading. I did not know it would fail completely. I am not a transit engineer." "Did you think about saying something?" Another pause, longer than the others. "I thought about it. I was uncertain whether it would be." The resonance chambers shifted, working through vocabulary. "Welcomed. Humans have been sensitive about Vale involvement in human infrastructure. The debates in your parliament last spring. The Transit Authority's memo about unsolicited technical commentary from non-human passengers. I was trying to be respectful of our discomfort," the older man finished. "Yes." Mara heard herself laugh. It wasn't a large laugh. It came out small and a little rough, the kind that escapes when what you're really doing is trying not to cry. "So you sat there," she said, "for 3 stations, noticing that the train was going to break down and said nothing, because you didn't want to make us uncomfortable." "That is approximately correct." "And then when the lights went out and we all panicked." "You did not panic." "We almost panicked." "Yes, almost." "You moved to the center of the car to make sure we didn't hurt ourselves or each other." "Yes." Mara pressed her fingers to her mouth. The fear was still there, yes. It always would be. She wasn't naive enough to think 3 years of policy documents had rewired something that took 300,000 years to install. But underneath it, newer, was something else. The feeling you get when you realize the stranger you were afraid of was afraid too and managed anyway. "Tell us about the drive coil," she said. The Vale's sensory clusters oriented toward her with what she had learned, slowly, over 3 years, to read as attention. "Tell you." "Explain it, the resonance failure. What's happening mechanically, if you can translate it into terms we'd understand." "I can try." "Good." She looked at the OIA woman, who nodded slowly. "Because she's infrastructure. And between the 2 of you, maybe we can figure out whether this is a wait for the repair crew situation or a we need to move situation." The veil unfolded itself slightly. Not all the way it kept itself low, Mara noticed, kept its upper limbs gathered rather than extended, making itself smaller, manageable. She wondered how long it had been practicing that. "The 4th drive coil generates a standing wave at 340 Hz. When I boarded at Westonstrasse, that frequency had shifted to approximately 318. The shift is consistent with a delamination of the resonance lining, the material that focuses the magnetic field into the propulsion channel. Without the lining, the coil cannot generate sufficient field to move the pod, but it can still generate enough field to cause interference with the pod's other systems." "Like the lighting," the OIA woman said. "Like the lighting, and potentially the door sealing mechanisms." The older man sat up. "The doors. They are currently sealed by magnetic locks on the same power bus as the 4th coil. If the coil's interference continues to increase, they could unseal," Mara said, "while we're in the tunnel. Or they could remain sealed after the magnetic interference resolves, if the fail-safe inverts. Both outcomes are possible. I cannot determine which is more likely without more detailed sensor data than I have." The OIA woman was already on her feet, moving to the emergency panel. Her fingers found the Braille text, ran along it, stopped. "There's a manual bypass. For the communications system, I can reach central dispatch directly if I can get the panel open." She paused. "I'm going to need light." Mara pulled out her phone. The screen cast a white rectangle in the green-lit dark. "Thank you," the OIA woman said. While she worked the panel, the older man looked at the veil. His newspaper sat folded in his lap. He had the composure of someone who had, at some point in his life, been in situations worse than a stopped train in a dark tunnel, and had filed the current situation accordingly. "How long have you been on Earth?" he asked. 31 months, personal elapsed time. "Do you like it?" A pause that had a different quality than the others. Longer, lower. "I find it very." The resonance chambers shifted through several frequencies before settling, bright, very loud, very fast. "The surface is difficult for me. I spend more time underground." In the transit system. In the transit system, in parking structures, in the lower floors of buildings when I can find them, anywhere with stone above me and reduced light. It is more, again that working through of vocabulary, legible. Surfaces are chaotic, too much data. Too much light, too much movement, too many acoustic profiles overlapping. Underground I can understand my environment. The older man nodded slowly. "My grandmother came from a very small village in Poland. She moved to Munich in 1975. She used to say the city was too loud to think in." "Yes," the veil said, "that is close." "She never left, though. Said the noise was worth it for the company." The sensory clusters were still. Mara had begun to think of this as the veil equivalent of a long look. "That is also close," it said finally. The OIA woman made a sound of triumph. The communications panel clicked open. She found the contact point by feel, pressed it, and a crackle of static filled the car. Then a human voice, slightly compressed, calm in the way that crisis dispatchers are trained to be calm. "Central Dispatch, I'm reading an anomaly on line 4, pod 7. Is anyone on board?"